My name is Beatrice Collins. I'm 34, and the moment my relationship ended didn't sound like heartbreak. It sounded like something settling into place, like a detail I had been ignoring, finally aligning too clearly to deny. I work as a civil engineer focusing on bridge maintenance projects across Rotterdam. My days are structured: early mornings, site inspections, reports that either make sense or don't. I like systems. I like things that behave predictably. People don't. Marcus Hale was 31 when everything started to shift. Corporate lawyer, fast-paced, high-pressure environment where every hour had a price attached to it. His life moved quickly. Late nights, constant calls, conversations that rarely stayed personal for long before circling back to cases, clients, or competition at his firm. When we first met, it felt balanced. He brought intensity. I brought stability. At least, that's what I believed. We had been together for just under 4 years. For the last year, we were living together in a small apartment near the river. From the outside, everything looked solid. Shared routines, shared expenses, conversations about the future that sounded real enough to stop questioning. But over time, something shifted. Not suddenly. Gradually, almost quietly. Marcus had always been ambitious. That was never the issue. I respected people who cared about their work. My entire career is built on long-term projects that require patience and consistency. But with Marcus, ambition wasn't just a priority. It was a scale, and everything else in his life was measured against it. Dinners moved because of last-minute client calls. Weekends disappeared into case preparation. Even normal conversations started feeling transactional. Like every topic eventually had to justify its value. I adjusted at first. That's what you do in relationships. You adapt, you make room. And I told myself it was temporary, that once he reached the position he was working toward, things would stabilize. Instead, they escalated. About 3.5 years into the relationship, I decided to propose. Not impulsively, carefully. Because Marcus valued structure, milestones, appearances. I thought this would make sense to him. From a practical standpoint, our lives were already intertwined. We had lived together for a year. Our finances were organized. Most of our friends already treated us like something permanent. Marriage felt like the next logical step. I chose a quiet Friday evening. No public scene, no surprises that would make him feel out of control. I cooked dinner. Nothing elaborate, just something familiar. We ate, cleaned up together, sat down on the couch with a glass of wine. And then, I asked. For a moment, Marcus just stared at me. Not shocked, not emotional, just processing. Like I had handed him something unexpected in a meeting. Then he sighed. Not softly, not warmly, just mildly irritated. And his first question wasn't what I expected. Did you actually think about the timing? I remember blinking, trying to catch up with the direction of the conversation. Because from my perspective, the timing was obvious. We were both in our early 30s, together for almost 4 years, living together. But Marcus leaned back, like he was preparing to explain something simple to someone who had missed the point. He said his career had to come first, not eventually, not temporarily. First, he started talking about his firm, promotion cycles, internal competition, how getting engaged right now would complicate things professionally. People would make assumptions about priorities, about future plans, about distractions. I sat there holding the ring box while he listed reasons like he was declining a contract. And the worst part wasn't even the words. It was the tone. There was no hesitation, no regret, just calculation. At one point, he actually said that if I understood how competitive his field was, I wouldn't have put him in that position. That was the moment something inside me paused, not broke. Paused. Because suddenly, it felt like we weren't having the same conversation anymore. I asked him something simple. Are you saying you don't want to marry me? Or just not right now? That distinction mattered. His answer didn't help. He said marriage was something he might consider later, once his position at the firm was secure, once he had more control. Then he added that right now he couldn't afford the distraction of planning a wedding or adjusting his priorities around a wife. The way he said wife, it didn't sound like a future. It sounded like an inconvenience. I asked how long later meant. He shrugged. 5 years. Maybe more, depending on how things developed. 5 years. I remember doing the math without meaning to. That would put us close to 40. And more importantly, it meant he expected everything to stay exactly the same until then. Like I was supposed to wait, indefinitely, while he decided if I still fit into his long-term plans. I told him that didn't sound like a partnership. His reaction was immediate. Sharp. He said I was being dramatic, that plenty of couples waited, that I was acting insecure, needing some kind of symbolic reassurance. And then he said something that changed everything. If you actually cared about my success, you'd support this instead of pushing outdated expectations. I remember sitting there looking at him, realizing how strange the conversation had become. I had asked someone I loved, someone I had built a life with, to marry me, and somehow I was the unreasonable one. That's when I closed the ring box. Not out of anger, out of clarity. And once that clarity settled in, I made a decision he didn't expect. The second the ring box clicked shut, the room changed. Marcus noticed it too. He tilted his head slightly and asked why I suddenly looked so serious, but there was irritation under the question. Not concern, not fear. More like he expected the conversation to reset itself, like I was supposed to exhale, apologize for the timing, and quietly put the ring away until it suited his schedule. Instead, I asked him something direct. I asked whether he actually saw a future where we built a life together, or whether he saw me as someone convenient to have nearby while he focused on becoming the version of himself he cared about most. He rolled his eyes almost immediately. That reaction told me more than his answer. He said I was being overly sensitive, that adults understood how priorities worked, that relationships had to adapt to professional goals, not the other way around. Then he gave me a look I had seen before in smaller moments, but never this clearly. Slightly superior, slightly dismissive, like he had already decided he was the only rational person in the room. Then he said that if I couldn't handle being patient while he built his career, maybe I wasn't mature enough to be with someone as driven as him. There are sentences that sting because they're cruel. And then there are sentences that settle more deeply because they reveal what someone has believed about you for a long time. That one did both. I remember looking at him and feeling something strange. Not panic, not heartbreak. Relief, because suddenly it was all visible. Every rescheduled dinner, every weekend ruined by one more urgent thing. Every time my needs had been framed as poor timing. Every time I had adjusted and told myself that love sometimes meant waiting. No, love might require patience, but it shouldn't require disappearing. I told him calmly that if marriage was something he might think about in 5 years, maybe more, then we were not building the same kind of future. He stared at me, actually stared, like the possibility had genuinely not occurred to him. I kept going. I told him I wasn't interested in staying in a holding pattern, while he decided whether I still fit into his long-term plans. I wasn't interested in being treated like a stable background detail while he arranged the rest of his life around the things he considered more important. For a few seconds, he said nothing. Then he laughed. Not kindly. Not nervously. The kind of laugh people use when they think the other person is bluffing and they're about to win by waiting them out. You're overreacting, he said. People don't end 4-year relationships over one conversation. We do, I said. The laughter stopped. I don't think it was the words alone that changed him. I think it was the fact that my voice stayed calm. No shouting. No dramatic tears. Just certainty. That seemed to disturb him more than anger would have. I told him the apartment lease was under my name and I had been living there before he moved in. So he needed to start looking for another place. For the first time that night, his expression cracked. The easy arrogance disappeared. The controlled tone slipped. What replaced it wasn't sadness. Not immediately. It was disbelief. He asked if I was serious. I told him yes. That's when the conversation escalated. At first, he tried to pull the situation back into familiar territory. He said I was being impulsive and childish, that I was throwing away 4 years because I couldn't handle waiting a little longer. But the phrase, a little longer, sounded absurd after what he had just said. 5 years minimum. Maybe more. No clear promise. No real timeline. Just indefinite delay packaged as ambition. I told him this wasn't about waiting a little longer. It was about being told, very clearly, that the future I wanted had no place in the version of life he was prioritizing. He started pacing the living room. That was always a sign with Marcus. When he lost control of a conversation, his body moved before his voice fully caught up. Short turns, tight shoulders, fast steps, like motion itself could recover ground he was losing. Then he started listing everything he had supposedly invested in the relationship. Time, effort, emotional support, sacrifices. It was interesting, hearing him say it that way. Like he was presenting evidence, like if he organized the words correctly, I would be forced to reach the conclusion he wanted. I listened, but my mind had already moved past the argument. When he was done, I told him something simple. If his career truly had to come before everything else in his life, then he deserved the freedom to pursue it without someone expecting a different timeline. And I deserved to build a future with someone who actually wanted the same things I wanted, without treating those things like obstacles. He hated that answer. Not because it was cruel, because it was clean. There was nothing in it for him to twist. That was when his tone changed again. Sharper, colder. He said I was making a mistake, that finding someone else at my age wouldn't be as easy as I seemed to think, that relationships like ours didn't come along often, that most men with his level of drive weren't interested in settling down as early as I apparently wanted. It was such a revealing thing to say, because it had nothing to do with love, nothing to do with regret. It was about leverage. It was about making me feel limited, replaceable, grateful. I remember looking at him and thinking very clearly, this is who he is when he thinks he might lose control. Not devastated, not vulnerable, strategic. And somehow that hurt less than it should have, because by then the truth was already too obvious to ignore. I told him he had the weekend to pack. Since the lease and utilities were in my name, and I had documentation showing I lived there first, the situation was straightforward. I didn't say that part with pride, just fact. But the effect on him was immediate. He looked genuinely stunned. And in that moment, I think he realized something that unsettled him more than the breakup itself. I had thought ahead, not because I had planned to end things, because some part of me had already understood, before my mind wanted to admit it, that love built on unequal priorities becomes unstable. And earlier that year, when we renewed the lease, I had quietly made sure I understood what my options were if things ever went wrong. He asked when I had looked into that. I told him the truth. The moment he said marriage was something he might consider in 5 years. That answer landed hard. The rest of that night went quiet. Not peaceful, just hollow. Marcus slept in the bedroom. I took the couch. I barely slept. Not because I doubted what I had done, but because 4 years is a long time to share a life with someone, and even when the ending is right, there is still a strange numbness that comes with watching something collapse exactly the way it was always going to. On Saturday, he moved through the apartment in clipped, efficient silence, drawers opening, closet doors sliding, boxes dragged across the floor. At one point, he took a phone call in the kitchen and lowered his voice when he realized I could hear him. I caught only fragments. Temporary. Just for now. I'll explain later. He still thought in terms of image. Even then. Especially then. By Sunday evening, most of his things were gone. A friend came to help with the last few boxes. I didn't know her well. She avoided eye contact. Marcus barely looked at me either, which was probably for the best. There was nothing left worth saying. But just before he walked out, he paused near the door and turned back. He said I would regret this. That one day I would realize how rare someone like him was. The line was delivered with the kind of confidence people use when they need to believe their own prediction more than they need anyone else to. I didn't answer, because by then the conversation had already reached its logical end. The door closed, and that was it. No dramatic final scene. No tears in the hallway. No last-minute reversal. Just silence. And the strange, unfamiliar feeling of a home becoming mine again. The first thing I noticed after Marcus left wasn't the silence. It was the absence of tension. For the first few days, I kept expecting something to interrupt the quiet. A phone call, a message, the familiar rhythm of his schedule bleeding into mine. But none of it came. And gradually, I realized how much of my life had been shaped around accommodating someone else's urgency. My apartment felt different. Not emptier, lighter. I went back to work on Monday. Bridge inspections don't pause for personal situations. Reports still needed to be filed. Structural assessments still had deadlines. And in a strange way, that helped. Civil engineering doesn't leave much room for emotional spirals. Either something holds, or it doesn't. There's comfort in that kind of clarity. The adjustment period was there, of course. 4 years is a long time to build habits with someone. There were small moments that caught me off guard. Reaching for a second coffee mug in the morning, pausing before making dinner, calculating portions out of reflex, hearing a notification, and instinctively expecting his name. But those moments passed, and what replaced them wasn't loneliness. It was steadiness, a kind of quiet I hadn't realized I was missing. About a month after the breakup, I noticed something else. I was no longer negotiating my own time. There were no last-minute cancellations, no subtle pressure to rearrange plans because something more important had come up, no underlying tension about whether I was asking for too much by expecting consistency. That realization stayed with me longer than anything else, because it reframed everything. The relationship hadn't just ended. It had been unbalanced long before that final conversation. 6 months later, I started dating again. Nothing serious at first. Just dinners, conversations, learning how to meet people without immediately adjusting myself to fit into whatever dynamic they preferred. I paid more attention to how people responded to simple things: time, effort, follow through. And one thing became very clear very quickly. I wasn't interested in negotiating basic life goals anymore. Not timelines, not priorities. If someone wanted a future that aligned with mine, we could explore that. If they didn't, that was fine. But I wasn't going to stay in a situation where the foundation itself was uncertain. That clarity made everything easier. About a year and a half after Marcus left, I met Daniel Carter. He was a project manager at an architecture firm in the same business district as my office. We met through a mutual connection at a small industry event. Nothing dramatic. No instant spark that felt overwhelming or cinematic. Just ease. Our first conversation lasted maybe 20 minutes. We talked about work mostly. Projects, deadlines, the strange overlap between engineering constraints and architectural design choices. He listened more than he spoke, asked questions that didn't feel performative, didn't interrupt. It was a small thing, but I noticed. When we started seeing each other, the difference became more obvious. Daniel was busy, but he didn't treat busyness like a personality. If he said he would call, he called. If we made plans, they happened. And when something came up, which it occasionally did, he communicated it without making it sound like my expectations were unreasonable. There was no competition, no subtle hierarchy where one person's career automatically ranked above everything else. Just two people, building something at the same pace. I didn't have to adjust myself to fit into his life. He made space, and I did the same. That was the difference. Our conversations were straightforward, not strategic, not layered with unspoken negotiations about who was sacrificing more. We talked about the future early, not as a pressure point, but as a way to understand whether we were moving in the same direction. And we were. Marriage wasn't a debate. It wasn't a delayed possibility pushed into some undefined future. It was a shared goal. When he proposed, there was no hesitation, no analysis of timing, no discussion about how it might interfere with anything else. Just a yes. Simple. Certain. We got married a little over 2 years later. The wedding itself wasn't extravagant. That never mattered to me. What mattered was the feeling that we were stepping into something we both actually wanted, not something one of us was tolerating. Life settled into a rhythm that felt right. Work stayed busy. My projects expanded. Daniel's firm took on larger developments. We built routines together. Lunches when our schedules aligned. Evenings that didn't feel rushed or secondary to something else. It wasn't perfect, but it was balanced. And that balance made everything else easier. The reason I'm telling this story now isn't because of how my relationship with Daniel started. It's because of what happened last week. Last Thursday started like any other. I had an early site inspection outside the city, so by the time I got back to the office, it was already close to noon. Thursdays were usually when Daniel and I met for lunch. His office was only a few blocks away. Around 12:15, I finished reviewing a maintenance report and sent him a quick message asking if he was ready. He replied that he'd be there in about 10 minutes. My office building has a small reception area on the ground floor, so I usually go down to meet him there. It's easier than having him navigate through the engineering department upstairs. I grabbed my jacket and took the elevator down. The doors opened, and the first thing I noticed was someone standing near the reception desk, speaking in a low, controlled tone that still managed to carry irritation. At first, I didn't recognize him. It had been years, but then he shifted slightly, and the voice clicked before the face did. Marcus. He looked different. Not dramatically, but enough. The sharp edges were still there, the posture, the way he held himself like he expected to be listened to. But something about it felt less solid now, like the confidence had been adjusted, not reinforced. The receptionist was explaining that he couldn't just walk into the offices without an appointment. Marcus sounded annoyed, like the rule shouldn't apply to him. For a second, I considered turning around, going back upstairs. There was no reason for me to get involved. No reason to reopen anything that had already been settled. But then he turned, and he saw me. His expression changed instantly. The irritation disappeared, replaced by something else. Relief, recognition, maybe even opportunity. He walked toward me like no time had passed at all. Beatrice. Wow, I was hoping that was actually you. That was the first thing he said. And before I could respond, he kept going. He said he had tried to look me up, found the company I worked for. He had been in the area for meetings and decided to stop by. Then he asked if I had a minute to talk. The timing of that question was almost perfect, because at that exact moment, the front door opened, and my husband walked in. Daniel stepped through the glass doors like he always did. unhurried, composed, carrying that same quiet presence I had come to recognize before I even saw his face. He smiled at me first. Then he noticed Marcus. The shift in his expression was subtle. Not alarm, not confusion, just awareness, the kind of awareness that reads a situation without needing it explained. Marcus turned slightly as well. For a moment, the three of us stood there in a triangle of unfinished history and present reality. I moved instinctively, not away from Marcus, toward Daniel. Just half a step, but it was enough. "This is my husband, Daniel," I said. "We were just about to go to lunch." The sentence was simple, but the effect was immediate. I watched it happen in real time. The confidence Marcus had walked toward me with, whatever version of the conversation he had rehearsed, shifted. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would draw attention from anyone else in the room. But I saw it. The recalculation. The realization that something fundamental had not gone according to plan. Daniel extended his hand politely. Marcus shook it. Brief. Controlled. Professional. Two men acknowledging each other without context, except there was context, and it was standing between them. Daniel didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. Marcus looked back at me. "When did this happen?" he asked. The question sounded casual, but there was something underneath it. I answered just as simply. "A little over 2 years ago." He nodded slowly, like he was adjusting to new information that conflicted with something he had assumed for a long time. Then he said something that made the entire situation clearer than anything else could have. "I was actually hoping we could talk," he said. "I've been thinking about how things ended between us." Daniel stayed quiet. He didn't step in. He didn't interrupt. That was one of the things I appreciated most about him. He knew when to let people reveal themselves. Marcus continued. He said a lot had changed for him. His tone had softened. Not the sharp, controlled cadence I remembered. This was slower, more measured, almost careful. He told me he wasn't at the same law firm anymore. That things there had shifted. Partners leaving, internal restructuring, promotion timelines collapsing into uncertainty. The position he had been working toward, the one that had justified everything else, was no longer guaranteed. He said the environment had become unstable. Competitive in a way that wasn't strategic anymore, just unpredictable. Eventually, he left. Now he was working at a smaller legal consultancy. Still respectable. Still successful by most standards. But not the trajectory he had built his identity around. I listened. Daniel listened. Marcus glanced between us as he spoke, like he was measuring reactions. Then his voice changed again. Softer. He said that over the past year, he had started rethinking a lot of things. Career, priorities, relationships, stability. And then he looked directly at me. "I've thought about that night," he said, more than once. The proposal, the rejection, the beginning of the end. He said he had been under pressure back then, that he probably hadn't handled it well. Probably. That was the word he chose. Not wrong, not unfair. Just probably. He said that at the time, he believed sacrificing everything for his career was the right decision. But now, he wasn't so sure. There was a pause, long enough to make the next part feel intentional. "Maybe we could talk sometime," he added. Properly, just the two of us. The suggestion hung in the air. Quiet, carefully placed. Daniel didn't react. Not outwardly, but I felt his presence next to me. Steady, grounded, real. And suddenly, the entire situation became very simple. Years ago, that question, an opening, a possibility, would have meant something. Now, it didn't. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied. And I did, in a distant, objective way. But I didn't hesitate. My life moved forward a long time ago. I gestured lightly toward Daniel. The future I wanted back then, I have it now. Marcus nodded. Once. But the disappointment was there. Clear, unhidden. For a few seconds, he didn't speak. And I could see it. The version of the outcome he had expected slowly collapsing. Maybe not a reunion, but a conversation. A possibility. An opening. Instead, there was a boundary. Simple. Final. He forced a small smile. Said he understood. But then he added something. And that was the moment everything fully aligned. "If you had just been a little more patient back then," he said, "things might have turned out differently." There it was. Even now. Even after everything. The framing hadn't changed. Not really. In his version of the story, the problem had never been what he asked me to accept. It had been that I didn't wait long enough. I didn't argue. There was nothing to argue about. We both made the decisions that made sense to us, I said, and life moved forward. Daniel's hand brushed lightly against my arm. A small gesture, but it grounded the moment. Marcus looked at the two of us again. Really looked this time. Not just at me, at what was standing next to me, what I had built without him. He nodded once more, said he wouldn't take up any more of our time. Then he turned and walked out. The entire interaction lasted maybe 6 minutes. No raised voices, no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet ending to something that had already ended years ago. Daniel and I went to lunch, like we had planned. Halfway through the meal, he asked me one question. "Are you okay?" I thought about it for a second. Not because I needed time to figure out the answer, because I wanted to be sure. And then I nodded. I am. And it was true. If anything, the conversation felt like confirmation. Years ago, I thought Marcus rejecting my proposal had destroyed the future I had planned. Now, I can see it clearly. It didn't destroy anything. It redirected me. Because if he had said yes that night, I would have spent years trying to compete with something that was never meant to include me fully. Instead, I built something that never required me to compete at all. And judging by the way Marcus looked as he walked out of that building, I don't think that was the ending he ever expected.